Greetings, everyone. Boy, Asian horror is really creepy stuff, isn't it? Man, yeah, you have like stuff like The Ring and The Grudge, and then of course Dark Water, which we talked about last time. Man, it just gets under your skin and freaks you out. But I'm glad to see that we're seeing so much more of it out here. I mean, it's great to see what scares other people in other cultures. It's fantastic, and it turns out the same stuff scares a lot of us. So, oh, there he is. Okay, let's head on downstairs to the crypt and see what Sam has picked out for us today. Hello, Sam. So, I'm hoping today you don't have things about little kids getting horribly killed. That would be nice, just for a change. I seem to have been seeing a lot of those types of movies lately. Yeah, yeah. So what have you got for us today? Oh, yes. Good choice. Okay, well, what we have here is a Midnight Movies double feature from 20th Century Fox. Tales from the Crypt and the Vault of Horror. Yeah, these are actually from the early 70s. A lot of you are probably familiar with the HBO series of Tales from the Crypt, which was quite successful and spawned a couple of movies. But this is actually the first time Tales from the Crypt was ever adapted for the screen. And the cool thing about it is, it's both Tales from the Crypt and Vault of Horror, and also includes stories from Haunt of Fear. They actually adapted all the stories in here directly from the original comics. So it's about as faithful an adaptation of the old 50s EC horror comics as you can get. And that's what we're going to talk about today on the Multimedia Chronicles. Welcome back. Yeah, this is a real treat. Tales from the Crypt and the Vault of Horror. If you're a fan of the anthology style of horror films, such as the recent Trick or Treat, which I know a lot of people, including myself, are huge fans of, then, if you like this is where this came from. This is basically going back to the roots of this type of film. Creep Show would be another one. Creep Show was very heavily inspired by the old EC horror comics. In fact, very directly inspired by those. Even going so far as to have the bogus Creep Show comic with the Crypt Keeper-like character, and the little comic book panel segments in between the stories. That was a huge homage to the old EC horror comics. Well, the first time that the old EC horror comics were ever adapted for film in any form, be it homage or direct adaptation or anything, was these two right here. 1972's Tales from the Crypt and 1973's Vault of Horror, both of course borrowing the titles from the original comics, and both containing 5 stories adapted directly from the original EC horror comics. Yeah, I don't know really what much I can say about them other than because one of the big things about these types of stories is they're kind of Twilight Zone-like in a way. Think of them as like really gory Twilight Zone episodes, because that's essentially the type of stories that you're looking at. Somebody does wrong or does something evil, or is just an innocent victim of some horrible evil force. And it's very rare for the characters to actually survive to the end of the story. Yeah, when you enter the world of Tales from the Crypt, you're pretty much doomed from the get-go. So, the whole thing about the original comics was basically just little horror stories built on shock value. In fact, a lot of the early ones, there was a series called Shock Suspense Stories. That encapsulates the concept right there. They were all about shocking the reader and such. So, seeing these old adaptations from the 70s is a real treat because, as I say, they're adapted directly from those old stories. So it's literally like seeing those old stories just brought to life and dramatized. And in that early 70s horror movie way. You know, there is just something about 60s and 70s horror that always terrified me as a kid a lot more than modern horror did. Because in the 80s and 90s and through till now, you had all of these pretty well-known special effects techniques and makeup techniques and such for the gore effects. Whereas in the 70s, you didn't really have things like prosthetics and body casts and things like that. So they had to be a little more creative in terms of how they depicted gore in the movies. And I think that, to me, made them more scary. Even though, as a kid, I very much would just immerse myself in these special effects books and magazines and whatnot. So I knew how they did stuff then, like in my era. But going back to the 60s and 70s, it was just it was all enshrouded in mystery. I would see these horror movies and these just spectacular gore effects and have no idea how they did them. So I found them more disturbing because they had that unknown quality about them. And when you go back and watch movies like this, like Tales from the Crypt and Vault of Horror, it very much has that flavor to it. And there were other anthology horror movies as well from that era. It was kind of a wave of them in the early 70s. They just seemed to be really popular for a while. I guess, they tended to be filmed on a fairly low budget, and I guess they were fairly easy to produce. I mean, especially in a case like this where you have ready-made source material, several years worth of comics to draw upon, and they were obviously popular. So why not? Easy moneymaker, right? Just license the rights and do some adaptations. So these were the ones that were based on, I guess, the most famous source material. There were other anthology horror movies put out. There was one in particular that I remember as a kid called Tales That Witness Madness. And funny story about that. Here's another little Sean anecdote for you. I remember seeing Tales That Witness Madness on TV one, I don't know, I guess it was around Halloween sometime, I'm assuming. And I'd seen some other movies of that type. I think there was one called, what the hell was it? Something about being on a train, not Terror Train. There's a bunch of train horror movies that are sort of along the same lines. I can't remember what it was. Anyway, it was another other type of anthology horror thing that I'd seen as a kid. And there were some other anthology horror shows on around that era as well, like Tales from the Dark Side and Monsters. What was it? The Dark Room was another one, and stuff like that. So I liked all of those. So anyway, going back to Tales of Witness Madness, this came on and I was watching it, and it was fun and stuff and scary. One of the things that stuck out to me was that one of the stars of one of the stories was Mary Tamm, who will be familiar to Doctor Who fans as the original actress to play Romana in Tom Baker's era. Yeah, so I was like, oh my god, it's Romana in a horror movie. And this was a few years before she had done Doctor Who, so she was still, quite young and beautiful. She actually played this girl who was essentially a virgin sacrifice. So it was kind of weird seeing Romana in this sort of victim role, because the character of Romana that she played was, a very strong, intelligent character and such. And, well, her character in Tales of Witness Madness was not. So what happens to poor Romana? Well, basically she gets butchered and turned into the dinner at this banquet. And the funny story part of it is, during the butchering scene, my dad was in the room, and he basically told me to look away from the screen. So I looked away, and I said, "Can I look now?" He's like, "No, I'll tell you when you can look." So my dad, of course, trying to be the good, protective parent, was trying to do me a favor by not having me witness this incredibly gory, scene. But the thing I guess he didn't take into account was the fact that while I was looking away, the sound was still going. So I could hear all of the slicing and ripping and tearing and sawing and spurting. And I am sure that the images conjured up by my imagination in that were far worse than anything that was actually on screen. And, well, I actually found the movie a couple of years ago and decided to brave that scene that had, if anything, having me look away traumatized me more than it would have just having me watch the scene. So I watched the movie, got to that scene, and there was like nothing going on in that scene at all. Like what my mind had come up with, just hearing the sounds, was far worse than was on screen. Basically, what was on screen, like what the scene was the girl had been killed, and then it was a scene of this guy basically butchering her to prepare her for the banquet. And you would think, nowadays, I'm sure that would be quite a brutal scene. But the way it was shot, it was all just implied and suggested. You would see, she'd lay down and the camera would like switch to another angle of like behind the table or something. So you couldn't actually see her at all. You just saw the guy going in with the saw and like making the motions and stuff. So obviously there's like nothing. They totally did it the cheap way. And there's nothing actually shown on screen whatsoever. So way to go, Dad. Yeah. Anyway, that was Tales That Witness Madness, which was part of the wave of anthology horror films that came out in the early 70s. Now, as for these two, let's actually talk about the two that are in the review. I highly recommend both of these. They are just so much fun. And they, you'll recognize a lot of sort of classic horror story elements in them. I mean, if you're a fan of the horror genre, just as a whole, you will have a blast with these movies because a lot of the stories from the original Tales from the Crypt comics were actually adapted from even older stories. One of the things I've been doing sort of as a side project is reading a lot of old horror stories and ghost stories. I'm talking like way back. Some of them are like 400 years old, and going up to about the early 20th century. And a lot of the stories that I've read there, I've seen show up. I mean, these are all public domain now, right? So people can do whatever they want with them. But I've actually seen a lot of those old stories show up in slightly modified form in stuff like Tales from the Crypt and other horror shows and whatnot. And it's interesting to me. Anyway, some of the ones in the movie are adapted from those comic stories that were adapted from those old stories. For example, there's one that's adapted from the classic Monkey's Paw story. Everybody knows the Monkey's Paw story. I mean, at the very least, I'm sure you've seen the Simpsons version of it. Well, in this case, it's not a monkey's paw. It's actually like a Tibetan doll or something. But the same thing, basically. It grants you 5 wishes. And as anybody knows, even from fairy tales, when you have an item or being or something that grants you wishes, you need to be very, very specific in your wording of your wish, or it's going to backfire on you in the most ironic and, in a horror story, horrifying way possible. And, the Tales from the Crypt version of that story is definitely no exception to that. It's quite horrifying, as it should be, and ironic as well. What else? There's another one that seems to be kind of loosely based on the picture of Dorian Gray, and, because well, a couple of things actually. Speaking of Doctor Who connection, that particular story is from the Vault of Horror, stars Tom Baker. Yes, Doctor Number 4 is the star of this, and this was, I think, like a year or two before he actually started on Doctor Who. So it's actually pre-Doctor Who Tom Baker. Very cool. Anyway, in that story, he plays a painter who is wronged by some guys. Basically, there's these critics who say that his art is worthless and such, and then he finds out that behind his back they've been selling his art for exorbitant sums of money, and his art is far from worthless. It's actually quite prized on the collector's market. So he basically sees this voodoo person. Gotta love those voodoo, random voodoo priests and whatnot that show up in these things. To give him some means of exacting his revenge on them. So what he does is he basically gets the power to affect anybody that he makes a painting of. So he makes paintings of the 3 guys who wronged him, and then he destroys the paintings in some way. And then the way in which the painting was destroyed is somehow reflected in various tragic ways that these people are killed. So like if he slashes across the throat of the picture in the painting, the guy might get beheaded or something like that, by something. Yeah, so using the magical power of voodoo, which we all know can do anything. There is nothing that voodoo cannot do. So, yeah. So anyway, what he ends up doing is he has a self portrait of himself, and he realizes very quickly if anything happens to that painting, then he could be in big trouble. So he has to take steps to protect the painting of himself, and it becomes almost an obsession. But I won't spoil how the whole thing turns out. But well, I'm sure you can probably guess where it's going to end up. But it's a really fun story, and it's definitely one of my favorites out of the bunch. Due in no small part to the fact that it's Tom frickin' Baker as the crazy painter. There's another one, actually, I think it's the first story in Tales from the Crypt, which features Joan Collins. Yes, the legendary Joan Collins as this wife who basically kills her husband on Christmas Eve. And then, so she's trying to, dispose of the body and stuff. And then there's this serial killer in town that just happens to randomly pick her house and is stalking her, trying to get into the house and stuff, and she can't call the police because she's got a dead body in her living room. So, so it's just this wonderful, like, multi-layered tension that's present in it. One of my all-time favorites out of this is actually the final story in Tales from the Crypt. And I want to tell you everything about it, but I can't because it's going to spoil it. But just trust me on this. Just trust me. This one is classic. It is just such a wonderful story of poetic justice. Basically, it's about this guy who owns this tenement, and all the tenants are blind. And what he's been doing is, sort of giving them just crappy food and turning off their heat and stuff like that, and just totally taking advantage of them. While he's living in decadence, they're living in poverty and just squalor. Well, let's just say that these blind tenants, and then ultimately one of them dies because of the cold, and that's the last straw. They decide, we got to figure out a way to get back at this guy because, he's just scum and does not deserve to live. And the means by which they exact their revenge, just all these blind people getting together with their ingenuity, their creativity, and coming up with the most wonderful, brutal, and just, as they say, poetic justice, revenge on this guy. It's just fantastic. So I definitely recommend, and it's the kind of revenge where, as it's playing out and you're seeing it unfold, you're just like, like just you're cringing in your seat, and it's just freaking brilliant. So, yeah, and that's just a few. That's just a handful of the story, just to give you some aspect of it. If you're expecting it to be like the TV series, the HBO series, don't, because the way it was put together was quite a bit different. It was never intended to be an ongoing series of movies. It was basically, I guess, the first one did well, and then the second one was cranked out the next year, because, they're, as I say, pretty low budget and cheap to produce. So, yeah, it doesn't quite have the same thing. Like, you don't have the cackling, moldy corpse puppet Crypt Keeper in it or anything like that. The Crypt Keeper is in it, in the first movie anyway. But he's just basically a mysterious guy in a robe. But he's played by Ralph Richardson, which is an actor some of you may be familiar with. He was quite an accomplished British actor. I should mention these are both British films as well, which, sort of automatically gives them a little bit of extra class, I find. The acting is a little bit better because most British actors, at least at the time, were classically trained and such. So there's, they're really well acted and they're really well put together. But yeah, Ralph Richardson is an actor that I always remembered from Dragon Slayer back in the early 80s, where he played the aging sorcerer Ulrich before he kind of passed the torch on to his apprentice to take care of the dragon problem. And but I always remembered him from that. So it was kind of funny seeing him like 20 years earlier. Well, not 20, well, I guess 10 years earlier. It just seems like 20 years because there's such a difference in film styles between the 70s and 80s. But anyway, it's interesting seeing him in sort of this low-key hosting role in the Tales from the Crypt. The Vault of Horror doesn't actually have a host character. It's just the five primary actors basically recounting their tales. Yeah, so pretty cool stuff. Yeah, I don't really know what more I can say about it. Essentially, I've sort of told you a little bit about some of my favorite stories from it. The funny thing is, Vault of Horror apparently does not contain any actual stories from the Vault of Horror comics, and it's mostly from Tales from the Crypt, and I think one from Shock Suspense Stories. And then Tales from the Crypt has, I think, actually hardly has any stories from Tales from the Crypt in it. It's actually a couple from Tales from the Crypt, a couple from Haunt of Fear, and I think one from Vault of Horror. So, yeah, go figure. But they were all essentially the same kind of thing. I mean, it's just they were all anthology comics. The only difference was each series had its own specific host character. But other than that, they were pretty much the same. Same shit, different pile. Yeah, I should also mention, speaking of Vault of Horror, the version that we have here is actually a cut down version. There is the way to tell is the running time. The cut down version is, I believe, 83 minutes, and the uncut version I think is, I'm guessing, around the same length as Tales from the Crypt, which I think is 96. Was it? No, 83 apparently. Okay, never mind. Anyway, yeah, apparently the version of Vault of Horror that we have here is a cut version, and I don't believe the uncut version is actually available on DVD. It was recently shown on television in the UK, like very recently, like 2008. It was shown on television there, and that was the first time the uncut version had been seen in quite a while, is my understanding. But sadly, we don't have that version here. So, what can I tell you? Oh well, but I mean, better to see it cut than not at all, right? So yeah, I absolutely, highest possible recommendation. Find these, watch them, and love them. Of all the horror anthology movies that I've seen, these two are definitely the best, like of the classic era ones. Yeah, and I cannot possibly recommend them highly enough. They are just a blast. They're so much fun, and yeah, and they've become pretty much traditional Halloween movies ever since. For me, anyway. So, let's take a quick look at the packaging and come back for goodbyes. Okie dokie. From the 20th Century Fox Midnite Movies collection, we have Tales from the Crypt and Vault of Horror. Love it. So, there we go. There's the spines. Both of them on there. This was actually a collection of 50 double feature movies. I have, or like DVD releases. Why am I talking about it? I'm going to put that in the review. Okay, here we go. Midnite Movies double feature from 20th Century Fox. Tales from the Crypt and Vault of Horror. Fabulous. So, that's that. And then the spine, very nice. And then on the back you have a little description of each one. Very cool. So the thing I like about this one versus a lot of the other Midnite Movies discs is a lot of the other Midnite Movies releases, like the double features, were actually flipper discs, whereas this one is not. It's both individual discs. How sweet is that? Yeah, so not too shabby. I'm very, very pleased about that. And sadly, no inserts, but that's okay. It's actually a simple but quality little set, and I like it a lot. And there you have it. So kind of nice that the one, if I could only have one of the Midnite Movies double feature collection, it would be this one. And it's kind of nice that this is one of the few that actually isn't a flipper disc. So yeah, that was a nice surprise. Very nice indeed. I'd really like to get the rest of the Midnite Movies double features. I have a handful of them. Maybe I think I have 4 of them total. There was actually a total of 50 in the collection. Each one has 2 movies, so 100 movies. Most of them are horror movies. Some of them aren't. There's some sci-fi ones, some just general B movies. But yeah, I'd definitely like to get the rest of the collection at some point. Anyway, that is it from me to you for now. Another epic length one. It seems like whenever I do the double features, they're ridiculously long. And then, of course, if I have anecdotes to throw in, they're even longer. But whatever. You guys don't come here for short stuff. You come here for thoroughness and that personal Zeranizrak touch. Alrighty. Well, that's it from me to you for now. So until next time, thanks for watching, and sayonara.